Have you ever heard two completely different stories about the same event and been told to believe both? That's exactly what happens when you look into the death of Judas Iscariot. For centuries, Christians around the world have been taught that Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, then died overwhelmed with guilt. But what if I told you the way he died is one of the most disturbing and mysterious contradictions in the entire Bible? And that beneath that contradiction may lie a hidden truth no one wants to talk about. In the Gospel of Matthew, we're told Judas threw the silver back at the priests and then went and hanged himself. Straightforward, tragic, and seemingly remorseful. But then, turn the pages to the book of Acts, and suddenly, Judas doesn't hang himself. No. Instead, he buys a field with the blood money, falls headfirst, and his body bursts open, spilling his guts across the land. That's not just a small inconsistency. That's a totally different death. A man doesn't both hang himself and fall headfirst and burst open. So what really happened? Why are there two stories? And more importantly, why is no one talking about it? Some say these two stories are just different angles of the same truth. But think about it. Why would one author mention only the hanging and the other focus on a gruesome body explosion? Why so much detail in one and none in the other? It raises a terrifying question: was Judas' death edited, manipulated, or altered to serve a purpose? A purpose to protect the narrative. Or worse, to hide a deeper truth about what happened to the man who betrayed the Son of God. Let's rewind. Judas Iscariot, one of the original 12 apostles. Handpicked by Jesus. A man who walked with the Messiah, saw miracles, heard divine teachings. And yet, he became the villain in the most famous betrayal in history. But ask yourself this: was Judas just a pawn? A necessary actor in a divine script? Some ancient texts, like the Gospel of Judas, say yes. They suggest Judas was actually following Jesus' own instructions. That his betrayal was part of the plan. That he wasn't acting out of greed or evil but obedience. Now imagine that. The traitor may have been the most loyal follower, but what happens when loyalty looks like betrayal? You can't fit that into a neat, clean narrative. The early church had to make sense of Judas. They couldn't allow ambiguity. They had to show consequences. Judas had to die. And he had to die in a way that made it clear he was wrong. But how he died? That's where things get murky. Because two sacred texts tell two different stories. And neither author explains the contradiction. What's even more chilling is that the field Judas dies in, according to Acts, becomes known as the field of blood. A Keldama. A cursed place. But even here, things don't line up. In Matthew, the priests buy the field. Judas is already dead. In Acts, Judas buys the field himself. So now we have not just two deaths, but two purchases, two timelines, two realities. It's almost as if we're being shown two parallel truths, one for those who follow the official line, and one buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Now let's go even deeper. The early Christians who compiled the New Testament were under pressure to present a united, uncontested truth. They faced persecution, division, and internal conflict. Having conflicting stories about Judas' death could be seen as dangerous. It suggested error. And error meant weakness. So they didn't explain the contradiction. They didn't harmonize it. They left it hanging, literally and figuratively. But some early church fathers tried to reconcile it. They said Judas hanged himself, the rope broke, and his body fell and burst open. Convenient, but think about that for a second. That's not what either account says directly. That's stitching two stories together in a way that fits a pre-approved theology. It's smoothing the rough edges of Scripture. But those rough edges? They might be clues that Judas' story didn't end the way we've been told. Clues that his death was far more complex, maybe even covered up. Could he have been executed by the priests to silence him? After all, Judas knew things. He knew Jesus. He knew the inner circle. Maybe he became dangerous. Maybe he started telling others that Jesus told him to do it. That changes everything. Suddenly Judas isn't the traitor. He's the messenger. And messengers are often silenced. There's even a strange echo of Judas' death in early Christian lore. Some stories say his body swelled unnaturally, filled with worms, and stank so badly that people avoided the area for years. That's not just a warning tale. That sounds like a legend built to instill fear. A way to mark someone as cursed beyond redemption. And who would want to spread that kind of story? Only those who needed to protect a narrative, so let's piece it together. Judas is chosen by Jesus. He's trusted. He's given authority. He betrays Jesus, or so it seems. He returns the money. In one story, he kills himself out of guilt. In another, he dies violently, possibly alone and abandoned. The field he dies in becomes cursed, stained with blood. But we're never told who found his body. We're never told who buried him. He just vanishes into mystery. Doesn't that feel deliberate? But some early church fathers tried to reconcile it. They said Judas hanged himself, the rope broke, and his body fell and burst open. Convenient, but think about that for a second. That's not what either account says directly. That's stitching two stories together in a way that fits a pre-approved theology. It's smoothing the rough edges of Scripture. But those rough edges? They might be clues that Judas' story didn't end the way we've been told. Clues that his death was far more complex, maybe even covered up. Could he have been executed by the priests to silence him? After all, Judas knew things. He knew Jesus. He knew the inner circle. Maybe he became dangerous. Maybe he started telling others that Jesus told him to do it. That changes everything. Suddenly Judas isn't the traitor. He's the messenger. And messengers are often silenced. There's even a strange echo of Judas' death in early Christian lore. Some stories say his body swelled unnaturally, filled with worms, and stank so badly that people avoided the area for years. That's not just a warning tale. That sounds like a legend built to instill fear. A way to mark someone as cursed beyond redemption. And who would want to spread that kind of story? Only those who needed to protect a narrative, so let's piece it together. Judas is chosen by Jesus. He's trusted. He's given authority. He betrays Jesus, or so it seems. He returns the money. In one story, he kills himself out of guilt. In another, he dies violently, possibly alone and abandoned. The field he dies in becomes cursed, stained with blood. But we're never told who found his body. We're never told who buried him. He just vanishes into mystery. Doesn't that feel deliberate? And here's the most shocking part. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Judas throws the silver back at the priests, they say, "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." Cold. Detached. But then they use that very silver to buy a field to bury strangers. Strangers. Not one of their own. That field, bought with the price of betrayal, becomes a graveyard for the forgotten. Including, perhaps, Judas himself. As if to say, you are now a stranger. You no longer belong to us. What if Judas didn't die because he was evil, but because the story needed a villain? What if his end was rewritten, reshaped, and retold to fit a theology that couldn't allow for complexity? What if the real Judas was a man torn between loyalty and destiny? Who followed a path laid before him, only to be destroyed by the very people he tried to serve? And what if that truth, too dangerous, too uncomfortable, was buried with him in that cursed field? But there's more. Let's talk about something most people miss entirely. In the Gospel accounts, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. He weeps bitterly, and yet, he is forgiven. He becomes the rock of the church. But Judas, who perhaps believed he was helping fulfill prophecy, receives no such chance. No redemption. No restoration. Just death. Why is one man forgiven and elevated while the other is condemned and erased? Is it because one story was more convenient to preserve? Or is it because the truth about Judas was far more dangerous? In some early Christian communities, Judas wasn't hated. He was pitied. Some even viewed him as a tragic figure, a necessary piece in God's plan. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the 1970s and translated decades later, paints him as someone chosen by Jesus to carry out the betrayal so that salvation could unfold. If that's true, then Judas didn't betray Jesus out of malice. He did it out of obedience, and that makes his death not just tragic, it makes it unjust. But official doctrine couldn't allow that. A church built on divine justice couldn't afford ambiguity in the story of its greatest betrayal. Judas had to be evil. He had to suffer. And his death had to be horrific, shameful, unforgettable. That's how you secure loyalty. That's how you warn others. That's how you silence questions, yet, the questions refuse to die. Because something about Judas' story doesn't sit right. The silence around his burial. The contradictions in his death. The cursed field. The lack of closure. It's as if history is whispering to us, look closer. Ask more. Don't accept the first version you're told. Because the truth might be darker, deeper, and more uncomfortable than anyone ever dared to admit. And here's another chilling layer. The number 30. Judas was paid 30 pieces of silver. That number has weight in Jewish tradition. In the book of Exodus, 30 pieces of silver was the price paid for a slave who was gored by an ox. A dead slave. That's the value assigned to Jesus' life. And who paid it? The religious leaders. They valued Jesus as no more than a slave. And Judas accepted it. Or did he? What if the money wasn't payment? What if it was a trap? What if Judas was being manipulated by the religious elite, used to create a legal pretext to arrest Jesus without public outrage? And when he realized it, it was already too late. His return of the money wasn't just guilt. It was protest. His suicide, or whatever truly happened, wasn't just despair. It was a symbol. A final act of rebellion. Or a silencing by those in power, because if Judas started talking, if he began to tell people that Jesus instructed him to do it, that would unravel everything. It would sow confusion. It would make people question the narrative. And nothing is more dangerous to a movement than questions. Especially at the beginning. Especially when people are choosing sides. Judas had to disappear. Quickly. Messily. Decisively. But even death couldn't erase him completely. His name lives on, synonymous with betrayal. His role immortalized as the ultimate traitor. But the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the unresolved threads, they haunt the scriptures like a ghost. A reminder that even in sacred texts, history is written by the victors. And sometimes, that means the truth is buried. Maybe Judas wasn't the monster we've been told he was. Maybe he was the scapegoat. The necessary evil. Or maybe he was something even more terrifying, a misunderstood servant who obeyed a command so dangerous, so unorthodox, that the world wasn't ready for it. And maybe his real crime wasn't betrayal, but obedience to a plan too radical for anyone to accept. In the end, we're left with a field soaked in blood, a broken body, a dangling noose, and a question that echoes through time: how did Judas really die? The official story leaves gaps. The alternate accounts raise doubts. And the truth? The truth might still be buried in the dirt of Akeldama, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. So next time someone tells you Judas was just a traitor, ask them which version they believe. Ask them if they've read both stories. Ask them if they've considered the possibility that Judas was more than a villain. Ask them what they'd do if obedience looked like betrayal. And then ask yourself the same question, because in the shadows of history, the line between loyalty and treachery is thinner than we've ever imagined.